So for those that don't know, in the cannabis industry, commercially, there's some very popular labels that are used that are purported to tell you different types of cannabis that are out there, meaning that one type will have tend to have one effect, one type will tend to have another effect. And those labels exist on two main levels that you'll hear about. So at the higher level, you have the basic three categories for cannabis flower and other cannabis products that you often see in a dispensary, and that's indica, hybrid, and sativa. So the claim, if you were to walk into a dispensary, you will almost certainly be told by a bud tender, the people that are basically responsible for getting you a product and recommending something to you. You'll be told very matter-of-factly that indica strains will make you relaxed or sedated, sativa strains will make you energized or creative, and hybrid strains, being a hybrid of the two, will be somewhere in the middle. It's a very simple and intuitive system. The big open question is it true at all? The reason this, even before I answer that, but the reason this nomenclature exists is really due to the legacy of prohibition and how legalization has rolled out in the U.S. Because cannabis has been around for so long. It's been in the United States since early 20th century. We've had decades and decades and decades of seeds coming in, growers in the illicit market illegally growing this, cultivating this, hybridizing different strains, and very creatively and systematically in many ways creating new cultivars. So if you talk to a botanist, they'll often, everyone has like their own language. If you talk to a botanist, they'll talk about cultivars. If you talk to a traditional cannabis grower, they'll talk about strains, which is sort of a term co-opted from microbiology, right? Different strains of a virus, different strains of a bacteria. They sort of co-opted that and started using it to describe the different cultivars, the different types of plants that they were breeding. And then, more recently, you'll have scientists like Ethan Russo and others talk about chemovars. So, thinking about it, not in terms of the physical features of the plant, which is traditionally how people in cannabis think about strains. Does it have broad leaves or narrow leaves? Is it short or tall? Does it have a relatively fast or relatively slow growth cycle? But thinking about it in terms of its chemical phenotype or its chemotype. Is it THC dominant or CBD dominant? If it's THC dominant, what kind of terpene profile does it have? And so if you think about it, it must be true that if there are psychoactive or medicinal effects of different types of cannabis, if there truly are different types that tend to have different effects on average, that must mean that their chemistry is different, right? Because the effects are going to be caused by the chemistry. So if you just sort of think about it, very simple, logical terms, if it's true that indicas are different from sativas in terms of their effects, then if you go look at all of the indica samples and you look at all of the sativa samples and you look at their chemistry, there must be some kind of difference there, And as is often true on the internet for these things, depending on where you look, you'll get contradictory answers. You can find websites that'll essentially say indicas are more sleepy because they have more THC. And then you'll have other people say, well, sativas are energizing because they have more THC. So, and there's very rarely any data attached to these claims. People that are slightly more sophisticated will tell you, again, very matter-of-factly, well, indica strains tend to have higher levels of the terpene myrcene, and that's why they're sedating and blah, blah, blah. But again, very little data actually attached to a lot of these claims. And so we wanted to assess whether it could be true in principle, whether or not different categories like indicas versus sativas or different strain names could actually have different effects. And that means, do they actually have, on average, a different chemical profile? And so we just looked at the data. And what that means is we took in and looked at tens and tens of thousands, many tens of thousands of samples across several different states in the US, as I mentioned. We looked at their cannabinoid profile and we looked at their terpene profile. And we mapped out that chemistry. And then we simply asked, how well does the indica sativa hybrid label attached to many of those samples match up with the chemistry? And then we did the same thing for strain names. So That work is about to be submitted, and a preprint will go up probably this month. So that will be like available to read on the internet as it's going through peer review. But just to give you a preview, the basic answer is when you map out the chemistry of commercial cannabis in terms of cannabinoid and terpene profiles, it pretty much does not line up in any clear way with indica sativa hybrid. In other words, if you close your eyes and you pick a random strain off a dispensary shelf, that's an indica, and you close your eyes and you pick another one off a shelf that's a sativa, they're no more likely to be different from each other than they are similar to each other. Another way of saying that is if you compare that random indica to a random sativa, they're really no more likely to be different than if you pick two random indicas or two random sativas. Now, what's sort of interesting about that is one way that could be true is if all the THC dominant cannabis commercially is pretty much the same, but it's not. So there actually is a chemical diversity out there. That diversity is simply not captured by the indica hybrid sativa labels as they're used in the commercial marketplace very well.